January 17, 1942, North Atlantic. 0400 hours. The convoy stretched across the black water like a chain of stars fallen to earth. 43 merchant ships, their hulls heavy with steel, grain, and diesel, plowed through 15-foot swells under a moonless sky. On the bridge of the SS Robert E. Peary, Third Officer Thomas Hendricks watched the horizon through salt-crusted windows, his breath fogging the glass. The radio room hummed below deck, a constant chatter of coded messages bouncing between escort destroyers and the convoy commodore. Outside, the wind carried the smell of brine and bunker oil. Somewhere beneath those waves, German U-boats prowled in wolf packs, listening, calculating, hunting. But tonight, like so many nights before, the convoy would pass unseen through waters where others had burned. The mathematics of survival in 1942 were brutal and simple. German submarines sank 1,160 Allied merchant ships that year, over 6 million tons of shipping sent to the bottom. In the first 6 months alone, U-boats prowled the American eastern seaboard in what submariners called the second happy time, torpedoing tankers so close to shore that residents of Virginia Beach could see the flames from their bedrooms. The North Atlantic had become a graveyard of steel and men, a killing field where convoys dissolved into floating debris and oil slicks that burned for hours. British intelligence estimated that if losses continued at that rate, Britain would starve before 1943. The entire outcome of the war hinged on a question no general could answer with guns. Could cargo cross an ocean controlled by an enemy who seemed to know every route, every departure time, every destination? Yet certain convoys moved like ghosts. They zigzagged through submarine patrol zones without incident. They altered routes based on intelligence that seemed impossibly precise. They received warnings of U-boat positions before periscopes broke the surface. The Germans noticed. In the labyrinth of Kriegsmarine headquarters on Cipher in Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz studied loss reports with growing frustration. His wolf packs reported empty seas where intelligence predicted rich targets. Convoys that should have sailed into ambushes simply weren't there. British routing seemed not just lucky but prescient, as if the Royal Navy could read his operational orders before his own captains received them. What Dönitz couldn't know, what no Axis cryptographer would discover throughout the entire war, was that every message his U-boats sent, every position report and attack order transmitted in unbreakable Enigma cipher, was being read in near real time by Allied codebreakers. And the Allied response, every routing change and convoy instruction, was encrypted by a machine the Germans could not crack, could not even imagine: the American SIGABA. The story of SIGABA is the story of invisibility as a weapon, of mathematics as armor, of a secret so well kept that even allies who shared battlefields didn't share its protection. While Enigma's breaking at Bletchley Park has filled libraries and launched 1,000 retellings, SIGABA remains a ghost in the machine. The cipher device that never fell, the code that was never broken, the secret that held even when secrets were sold, stolen, and betrayed across every other front of the war. Its silence saved not just convoys, but the entire architecture of Allied communication, creating an asymmetry of information so profound that Axis commanders fought blind against an enemy who could see. The roots of SIGABA reached back to 1935, before the war had names or front lines, when 3 American cryptologists sat in a sweltering Washington office and contemplated the nightmare of mechanized encryption. William Friedman, Frank Rowlett, and Lawrence Safford had spent years breaking codes created by humans, studying the mathematical fingerprints that repetition and pattern left behind. But the new generation of rotor machines, complex devices that scrambled messages through rotating cipher wheels, presented a different problem. The Germans had Enigma. The Japanese were developing their own rotor systems. These machines didn't just substitute letters. They transformed language into chaos, with billions of possible settings and no two messages alike. Friedman understood that the coming war would be fought in 2 theaters, the visible one of ships and soldiers, and the invisible one of signals and silence. Whichever side could communicate securely while reading enemy traffic would possess an advantage. More decisive than any battleship, The American military already used the M209 and the older M94 Cipher devices, mechanical tools adequate for tactical communication but fundamentally vulnerable to sustained cryptanalysis. Friedman needed something revolutionary, a machine whose output would resist even theoretical attack by cryptographers with unlimited time and resources. The device that emerged from 4 years of development was unlike anything else in the world. While Enigma used 3 or 4 rotors in a relatively simple configuration, SIGABA employed 15 rotors working in 3 cascading banks, 5 cipher rotors that actually encrypted the message, 5 control rotors that determined how the cipher rotors would step, and 5 index rotors that governed the control rotors' behavior. The result was a machine with complexity that grew exponentially rather than linearly, where the number of possible rotor positions exceeded 10 to the power of 76, a number larger than the estimated number of atoms in the observable universe. But mathematics alone couldn't guarantee security. Friedman incorporated principles learned from watching Enigma's failures, designing SIGABA with no reflector, the component that created symmetrical encryption in German machines and left exploitable patterns. He added irregular stepping, where rotors moved not in predictable sequences, but according to the output of other rotors, creating polyalphabetic substitutions so complex that statistical analysis became meaningless. He demanded that the machine produce ciphertext that was statistically indistinguishable from random noise, with no repeating patterns even across millions of characters. By 1940, when SIGABA entered service, it represented the apex of cipher machine design, a device so thoroughly hardened against attack that the U.S. military used it for the highest classification of message traffic, including communications about atomic weapons development and invasion planning. The Germans expected patterns. Their entire cryptanalytic tradition, refined through decades of European diplomatic code-breaking, relied on finding the seams in language, the frequencies, the repetitions, the linguistic habits that survived encryption. German intercept stations recorded thousands of Allied radio transmissions daily, feeding them to the B-Dienst, the Naval Intelligence Service's Cryptanalysis Division. These same analysts had broken British Naval Cipher No. 3 in 1941, reading convoy routing messages and feeding wolf packs with targeting data that turned the North Atlantic blood red. They approached American traffic with confidence, expecting the steady work of frequency analysis and known plaintext attacks to eventually peel back whatever system protected U.S. Navy communications. They deployed their best mathematicians, linguists, and signal intelligence specialists. They captured equipment when possible, interrogated prisoners, ran exhaustive tests on intercepted messages. They found nothing, no patterns, no repetitions, no linguistic fingerprints. The messages might as well have been atmospheric static, meaningless noise that refused to resolve into language no matter how sophisticated the analysis. Japanese cryptographers faced the same wall. The Imperial Navy's Communication Intelligence Unit had achieved remarkable successes against other codes, breaking into U.S. consular ciphers before Pearl Harbor and reading certain tactical codes throughout 1942. But SIGABA traffic remained opaque, a wall of random gibberish that yielded no footholds. After the war, captured documents revealed that Japanese analysts had classified the American machine cipher as unsolved and directed resources toward softer targets. They never even came close. The mathematical principles that governed SIGABA's output were too alien, too removed from conventional cipher machine design, for cryptographers trained on European systems to even recognize the type of attack that might be attempted. What frustrated Axis codebreakers was precisely what saved Allied lives. Every convoy routing message sent via SIGABA was effectively invisible to German intelligence. When the convoy commodore radioed escort destroyers about course changes, when Admiralty in London transmitted U-boat position reports based on decrypted Enigma traffic, when American naval headquarters in Washington sent operational orders to fleet commanders, all of it traveled through airways the Germans monitored constantly but could never read. The asymmetry was absolute. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park could read Donitz's orders to his U-boat captains before the submarines received them. German intelligence could only record Allied transmissions and file them as noise. The war's intelligence architecture had become fundamentally one-sided, but the Germans didn't know it. They continued to assume their Enigma system was secure, while suspecting Allied routing changes were due to improved radar, better sonar, or simply luck. The impact extended far beyond convoy protection. SIGABA secured communication for Operation Torch, the 1942 North Africa landings, where American forces coordinated with British units across thousands of miles of sea and desert. It protected planning for the Sicily and Italy campaigns, encrypted orders for the D-Day invasion, and secured MacArthur's island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. Most critically, it safeguarded all communication related to the Manhattan Project. Every message about uranium enrichment, weapons design, and test site construction traveled through SIGABA encryption. The Soviets, allies on the battlefield but already hunting for atomic secrets, could intercept the radio traffic, but never read it. Klaus Fuchs and other atomic spies had to physically steal documents and relay information through courier networks. Soviet signal intelligence never broke the cipher that protected American nuclear communications. The machine itself was a monument to American industrial capacity, another form of abundance the Axis couldn't match. While Germany produced roughly 40,000 Enigma machines during the war, using standardized parts and simplified manufacturing, the United States manufactured only about 10,000 SIGABA units, but each one required precision machining and complex assembly that only American industrial facilities could sustain. At scale while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, and tanks, SIGABA wasn't designed for mass production or field expedience. It weighed 52 pounds, required regular maintenance by trained technicians, and demanded reliable electrical power. It was a Cipher machine that assumed industrial support, secure logistics, and technical infrastructure, luxuries that reflected American material superiority as much as cryptographic sophistication. The Germans could capture one, as they eventually did when U-505 was boarded in 1944, but reverse engineering the mathematics required understanding principles of irregular rotor stepping and multiple bank interaction that Axis cryptographers hadn't conceived. The German expectation was that technology could be matched, that any machine built by humans could be broken by humans with sufficient effort. This was the lesson of the Great War, when all combatants eventually broke each other's codes through patient analysis and captured documents. The Germans believed in the solvability of ciphers, the inevitability of patterns, the mathematical certainty that enough data would reveal structure. They applied this philosophy to Enigma's security, confident that even if some messages were compromised, the system as a whole remained sound. What they experienced instead was a fundamental rupture in that assumption, an enemy whose communications were simply absent from the battlefield of signals intelligence. SIGABA traffic existed only as intercepted noise, recorded and filed but never decrypted, never analyzed successfully, never yielding a single sentence of plaintext throughout 4 years of global war. The symbolism resided not in the machine itself, but in what it represented. The security of speech, the freedom to coordinate without fear, the ability to move information across a hostile world as if through a private corridor. In an era when every radio transmission was potentially a beacon to enemy ears, SIGABA created zones of silence, islands of privacy in the electromagnetic storm. American commanders could debate strategy over radio links without sanitizing their language or speaking in metaphors. They could transmit exact coordinates, unit designations, and operational timelines with precision that would be suicidal using less secure systems. The Cipher machine became a kind of invisible fortress, a perimeter that moved with the message, protecting not ground but meaning itself. This freedom of communication created compounding advantages. While German commanders worried about radio security and often relied on couriers or landlines that created delays, American officers coordinated in near real time across oceans. Eisenhower in London could speak candidly with commanders in North Africa, Sicily, and later in France, orchestrating operations across 3 theaters with a flow of information that would have been impossible under communications blackout. MacArthur in the Pacific could coordinate with Nimitz, with Washington, with logistics commanders in Hawaii, building consensus and adjusting plans on timescales that German operational security couldn't match. The paradox was that the more Americans communicated, the more secure they became. The volume of SIGABA traffic created no additional vulnerability because each message was individually protected by mathematical chaos. British cryptographers, who worked alongside Americans at key signals intelligence sites, understood what they were witnessing. Commander Edward Travis, who headed Bletchley Park's naval section, described SIGABA in internal memoranda as cryptographically superior to any cipher machine in European service, Allied or Axis. The British asked repeatedly for SIGABA units to protect Royal Navy communications. The Americans refused, not from distrust, but from understanding that the security of SIGABA rested partly on its exclusivity. The fewer machines in service, the less enemy exposure to the system, the lower the risk of one being captured and studied. Even within the American military, SIGABA was restricted to high-level command communications. Tactical units used M209s and other simpler devices. SIGABA protected the strategic layer, the big picture, the operational art, the decisions that shaped campaigns. The British continued using Type X cipher machines, mechanically similar to Enigma, and considerably less secure than SIGABA, because the Americans valued cryptographic monopoly over alliance coordination. The irony cuts deep. While Allied propaganda celebrated partnership and shared sacrifice, the architecture of trust had limits. The same Americans who landed at Omaha Beach alongside British forces, who died in hedgerows fighting toward a common goal, operated under a communications hierarchy that trusted mathematics more than brotherhood. SIGABA's restriction reflected a truth about wartime alliance. Cooperation on the battlefield didn't require transparency at headquarters. The Soviets, who bore the war's bloodiest burden on the Eastern Front, never received SIGABA machines and were never informed of their existence. Churchill and Roosevelt coordinated D-Day using SIGABA encrypted links while Stalin's communications with his own marshals traveled through less secure Soviet systems than German. Intelligence partially compromised. The asymmetry of information extended not just against enemies, but among allies, a hierarchy of secrets that would shape post-war intelligence relationships. By 1943, the tide had turned in the Atlantic. U-boat losses exceeded replacement rates. Wolf packs that once ravaged convoys found themselves hunted by escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft guided by intelligence of uncanny precision. Dönitz withdrew submarines from the North Atlantic in May 1943, a strategic defeat from which the Kriegsmarine never recovered. Historians debate the causes: improved radar, better sonar, escort carriers, long-range aircraft, the closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap. All were factors. But threading through every tactical advantage was the invisible victory of signals intelligence, the ability to read Enigma while protecting Allied communications with SIGABA. German submarines went to war blind, unable to coordinate effectively because every radio transmission risked interception and decryption. While Allied convoy planners orchestrated routing changes based on real-time U-boat positions, extracted from the very messages the Germans believed secure. The greatest triumph of SIGABA was that the Germans never knew. Even after the war, even after Enigma's compromise became clear through captured documents and testimony, Axis cryptographers remained largely ignorant of SIGABA's role. They learned they'd been read. They never fully understood that they couldn't read back. The Americans maintained operational secrecy about SIGABA until 2001, 56 years after the war ended, declassifying details only when the encryption technology was so obsolete that historical disclosure posed no security risk. For over half a century, the device remained classified above top secret, protected by security protocols that outlasted the Soviet Union and Cold War. Veterans who'd operated SIGABA machines carried the secret to their graves, bound by oaths that didn't expire with peacetime. The silence around SIGABA was itself a form of encryption, protecting not just the mathematics, but the knowledge that such mathematics had existed. What changed for those few who knew? The cryptographers and signals intelligence officers who understood SIGABA's invulnerability gained a perspective their enemies never possessed: the recognition that security was possible, that secrets could be kept even in the electromagnetic maelstrom of modern war. While German and Japanese signal officers lived with the constant anxiety of compromise, American communication specialists worked with the confidence of absolute protection. This psychological asymmetry mattered. Commanders who trusted their communications could think more freely, plan more boldly, coordinate more ambitiously. Paranoia about leaks, which constrained Axis operational planning, didn't infect American command culture to the same degree. The invisible shield of SIGABA created not just tactical security but strategic confidence, a kind of freedom from fear that translated into more aggressive, more coordinated, more effective operations. The machine's legacy persists in principles that govern encryption to this day. SIGABA demonstrated that security doesn't come from complexity alone, but from complexity that eliminates exploitable patterns. Modern encryption algorithms, AES, RSA, elliptic curve cryptography, embody Friedman's insight that ciphertext must be statistically indistinguishable from randomness. The rotor banks and mechanical stepping have been replaced by mathematical operations on binary data, but the principle remains. Encryption succeeds when it removes all structure, when encrypted messages contain no information about their plaintext except what can be extracted through brute force attack on key space. SIGABA proved this was achievable with 1930s mathematics and mechanical engineering. That proof shaped cryptographic philosophy for every generation that followed. In the end, SIGABA embodied a peculiarly American approach to security, not through isolation or silence, but through abundance of communication protected by mathematical sophistication. Where totalitarian powers hoarded information and restricted transmission, the United States built infrastructure for constant, secure coordination across global distances. The machine represented the marriage of theoretical mathematics and industrial capacity, of abstract cipher theory and practical engineering, of scientific talent and manufacturing scale. It was a weapon the enemy never saw, a fortress that cast no shadow, a secret preserved not just through classification, but through the mercy of mathematics that made breaking it not just difficult, but effectively impossible. The convoys that slipped through wolf-pack cordons, the invasion plans that remained secure until execution, the atomic project that the Soviets couldn't penetrate through signals intelligence, all of it rested on a machine whose existence the Axis never confirmed. SIGABA didn't shorten the war through dramatic action. It shortened the war through absence, through the attacks that didn't happen, the ambushes that failed, the secrets that remained silent even while traveling through airways the enemy controlled. Its victory was the victory of information itself, the recognition that in modern war, what the enemy doesn't know can be as decisive as what you do know. The machine was destroyed in 1959. The last operational units melted down when new technology rendered them obsolete. No museum held them. No public display celebrated their service. They vanished into classified memory, existing only in sealed documents and the dimming recollections of men and women who'd operated them under oaths that lasted lifetimes. When SIGABA finally emerged into the historical record, the world had moved on. Encryption had become ubiquitous, invisible, something every phone carried without thought. But the principle remained, carved into the architecture of digital age security, that freedom requires privacy, that coordination demands trust, and that both rest on mathematics too strong for enemies to break. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, metal fragments of merchant ships rest on the seafloor, ships that sank when convoys were visible, when routing messages were compromised, when the enemy could read intentions before they became actions. And somewhere in those same waters, ghost tracks mark the passages that survived. Convoys that sailed through killing grounds unnoticed, protected by a silence the enemy never understood. The difference between rust and safe passage was information, secured by a machine whose name would remain secret longer than the war it helped win. In the end, that silence spoke louder than any proclamation of victory, because it represented something totalitarian powers could never achieve: the freedom to speak openly among allies while remaining forever hidden from enemies who listened but could never hear.